Hi and welcome to this image editing special. Now I am making the raw files available so you will be able to follow along step by step with the workflows I'm just about to show you. So if you have any questions about the images, how I captured them or how I've processed them, just drop them in the forums below and I'll catch you online. Hopefully you enjoy the seminar. Let's take a look at how we can create a triptych image. That's where I've got three images in the same layout. This is a great way of showing unfolding action or just three aspects of different subject. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into grid view, just press the G on the keyboard, and I'm just going to select three images from this grid view. I'm going to hold down the shift key as I click on that last image there. So now we've got three selected. Now we're going to come up over to the print module. And now I'll open up that left panel because I need to access something here called page setup. What I want to do is look at a landscape orientation for this triptych rather than vertical. So I'll select OK. Now we're going to come down to the templates here, and I'm going to click on the Lightroom template, which comes shipped with the Lightroom, called Triptych. Now we're going to come over to the right side, look for the layout options here, and we're going to deselect the keep square option there. Okay, so we've got three rows and one column, and I want it the other way around, so I'm just going to lower the rows to 1 and increase the columns to 3. Okay, so this is already starting to take shape, but what I'll need to do now is we can play with the sliders, or I can come into the layout area and just drag that right up to the top there, and also make sure that one is dragged right to the bottom. Going to need a little bit of cell spacing here, so we'll just come down to the cell spacing options and just drag that up a little bit so we've got a little bit of a gap between the three images. Now you can organize the three images you're selecting here. For instance, the image on the right I think would be better positioned in the center. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to just click anywhere in this film strip view. If you don't have this film strip view, just click on the bottom of your Lightroom screen so you can see all of the images from the grid view here. Now we can obviously alter which images are displayed here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click and then drag this over, okay, to allow me to use this as the center image. Now what we can do is select one, holding down the command key on a Mac, control key on a PC. I'm now going to select this one as the center image and skip one, and now select the one on the right there. Okay, so we've got the three images that I'm using in this triptych. Now you can see I can actually drag the images in here to make sure that all three are centered in that frame. So that's quite a nice little tip there. Once we've got that, I'm obviously not going to print this. We could obviously print this, but I'm going to go to the print job file, and instead of going to my printer, I'm going to JPEG file. And now we can just click on that print to file and decide where we're going to save this image. Okay, so I'll just cancel that because I've already created this, but there you go, we can quickly create a triptych inside of Lightroom. Let's take a look at how we can create that triptych using Photoshop instead of Lightroom. I'll select my three images. I'm going to hold down the command key on a Mac, that would be the control key on a PC, and click the three images that I want to add to my triptych. And I'll just click on this one, I'll skip one and take that one as my right side image. What I'm going to do now is export these three at a standard size. Because I've done different crops, I want them to be the same standard size when I'm creating that triptych inside of Photoshop. So I'll click on the export. Now I'm going to go for 2560 as my size here. Now because they're coming down from much larger files, I'm going to hit the resize to fit, long edge 2560, output sharpening checked, amount standard for screen. Okay, now I'm going to export those, and they're now exporting to the desktop. With all of those files safely exported from Lightroom, I'm going to select all three images and then open them in Photoshop. Now they'll appear in separate files. You see on the tabs here I've got ILC-2 and ILC-1 all as three separate files. Now we now need to get them into the same working area, so there is a script for this. We'll go to File, Scripts, Load Files into Stack. Okay, and I'm going to click on the Add Open Files button inside of this dialog box here and then select OK. Okay, now we've got all three files as layers inside of Photoshop. So what we're going to do now is we're going to select the crop tool in the tools panel, and then I'm going to drag the crop marquee to one side, so we've got a bigger canvas working area here. Now it doesn't have to be precise at this stage, we can fine tune later. So I'm just going to let go there, and then I'm going to hit the commit icon in the top toolbar there. Okay, now we've got a bigger canvas area to be working on. What we're going to do now is we're going to click on the lower layer in the layers panel, then holding down the command key on a Mac, control key on a PC, I'm going to click on the add new layer icon. Holding down that modifier key while we click on this create new layer ensures the new layer appears below the layer you selected. If for any reason this empty new layer appears not at the bottom, you can just click on it and drag it to the bottom like so. We're going to fill this with white now. We can go to the Edit Fill command, or using a keyboard shortcut here, and I've got white as the background color. If you don't have white as the background color, just press D on the keyboard, which sets white as the default color for the background. Then holding down the command key again on a Mac, control key on a PC, hit the delete or backspace key in order to fill that lower layer with your chosen canvas size. Now you could obviously choose to print or create a composite with the foreground color by holding down the Option or Alt key and then fill that with black. I'm going to choose white as that background color. This does give you a little bit of flexibility about what you have in your background when working with Photoshop. Okay, so now let's select the Move tool. That's the top icon in the Tools panel there. And what we can do now is I've got ILC-2 as my center, or ILC-3 as my center image now. Now I've got Auto Select switched off. Okay, otherwise it will just select the top image. You see, if I just have Auto Select on, it'll select whichever layer you click on. Okay, so let's just Auto Select off, and then select ILC-3 and then click and move that into position. You can see we've got these guidelines, these pink guidelines to help us align images inside of Photoshop. I'm now going to come to ILC-2 and then drag that one to the right here. Now you'll see that we're automatically getting advice about how to align these. You see I've got a 39 pixel margin on all three images. The canvas isn't quite large enough, so I'm going to have to click on that crop marquee tool again and drag that a little bit wider, as you can see, in order to get all three images into that canvas area, and then hit the Return Enter key to enter that. I'm also going to click on that crop marquee tool again. I want a little bit of a gap at the top and a little bit of gap at the bottom. So again, just increasing the canvas area like so, and then hit the Return Enter or hit the Commit Crop icon in the top there. Now with the you see the layer, we've got a little bit of a transparency there, so I'm going to come to the bottom layer there. Hold down the Command key on a Mac, Control key on a PC, and fill that with the white, the foreground color again. Just doing Command 0 to fit on screen, that's Control 0. And you see again I've got a little bit of a crop action to do here, just to create that final crop there, and hit the Return Enter key. Now we've got that triptych done inside of Photoshop instead of Lightroom. If I hit the Save Command S for save. We're going to get an option of where to save this, and whether to save it as a Photoshop file, or if I'm going to save it as a JPEG, I'm going to hit save as copy, and then choose my JPEG as the export file there, and we're embedding the color profile sRGB in this case. Okay, so I'll cancel that out, and that shows you how you can create that triptych inside of Photoshop instead of Lightroom. Let's take a look at the new masks feature inside of Lightroom CC and Lightroom Classic. You'll notice that we have a new icon here which replaces the radial graduated filters and little adjustment brush here. So we can get into these by using keyboard shortcuts as well. So for instance, if I just press the M key, it automatically opens up the masking panel with a linear gradient here. The shortcuts will change if you're using the CC version. Okay, so let's just drag a graduated filter here, just holding down the shift key to constrain that to a perfect vertical here, and then we'll just lower the exposure by 1 stop. Now as I drag lower, you'll notice the top of this iceberg is starting to become a little bit muddy in tones here, and so what I want to do is subtract this area from the mask. Now we've got a number of subtract options here. Just always check that you've got the word subtract here instead of add. There has been a minor bug with this new feature where you hit the subtract and it still says add. You would need to restart the software if that does occur to you. Hopefully it'll disappear with future releases. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose subtract select subject. So if you can find the iceberg, it will automatically subtract that from the mask, which it has done really well. I can come into this graduated filter and I could drag that lower or higher, and the brush area is independent of this graduated filter, which is really quite good. Let's just delete this area. I could have chosen to subtract luminance range instead. So we could go in with luminance range, and then I'll just drag my eyedropper over some of the brighter white tones of this iceberg, and you'll notice it removes a little bit more of the sky, so I don't quite like that effect as much, and you'll notice it's left some of the darker areas of that iceberg. I could go in and work with an additional tool, for instance subtract brush, and then just go in and remove some of those areas. Now when I'm working with a brush and I have a clearly defined edge to my subject, I'll use the auto mask option here, but I probably would have reverted and just used the subtract subject from this particular option, because that really worked quite well. So let's just move forward and demonstrate on another image here. So this is a black and white conversion that I've done, and so we'll go in and just hit the M key, which is the linear gradient, and then just drag that down again, holding down the shift key, bring that down, and you'll see that yes, I am darkening the sky, but we're losing the bright white clouds here, which is sort of a hero of this image. So I do want to subtract from the luminance range here and just select some of those bright white clouds. Now that's done that quite well. We do have the option, after using the eyedropper, is to come in with this luminance range ramp here. Now I wouldn't start with here, I'd always start with the eyedropper, but we can now fine tune that. We can come to the slider underneath and then control exactly how much of that sky we're darkening down. We also have an additional control inside of that ramp there, which is that tail end of that ramp, and this really is handling the transition on the feathered edge of these clouds, which is I prefer it just a little bit over to the right, to be honest, which is a little bit more subtle there. Okay, so again we've got some more controls over by going to the luminance range ramp after first deciding with the eyedropper what tones we want to exclude from this graduated filter. Let's go over to another image. This is an image that I've just shot on location of the emus. There was about 4 of these wild emus in this paddock in Australia. Now the sky is overly bright here, so we could try select sky and let the artificial intelligence work out where that sky is. It's even separated out the hills as well, so I could now just darken down that sky quite nicely, and perhaps adds a little bit of richness to that sky with saturation and a little bit more of a blue tint. Now if we notice that the transition here is not exactly what we want, and I wanted the horizon line to be a bit brighter rather than this unnatural edge that we've got going here, I would subtract a linear gradient and then just drag that up like so. So again we've got that fading blue, darker blue sky at the top fading through to that brighter horizon, and that's got rid of the unnatural edge that we had going here. Okay, so let's move over to another emu image that's also shot on the same shoot of these emus in this paddock. Got that beautiful sky. Now let's just remove the existing masks that I've already done. I've already demonstrated this image. So we can select sky, but it will probably only select the sky above the hills, and because we've got that very soft focus edge, it's probably going to leave an unnatural edge there. So I'll just do Command Z. So again we'll go in with select subject, and this will select the emu nicely, and we'll hit invert. Now you can invert in this panel here, and you need to do that on the subject component, not the mask component. You'll see on the 3 dots, which is the more options, we do have the option of inverting this mask, but you've also got the invert over here in the panel itself, which we can just invert. Now if you need to fine-tune the mask, I would always do the inversion before you add and subtract to fine-tune the mask, because if I zoom in a couple of times we'll notice that the select subject has missed out a couple of areas just between the legs and also underneath the chin here. So I'm going to hit the add option, hit the brush, and I'll just come in. We're working with 100% flow and density here, just using the open square bracket just to reduce the size of that brush as I paint in and fine tune that. And if we go over the area slightly, I'll just hold down the option key and remove some of that. And again coming in between the legs, and that auto mask should help in this instance because we've got quite a nice sharp edge there, and so now we've got a bit of an edge. I might go down with density to 50 or so, and there's a little bit of area where I can see a little bit of the background through some of the feathers on the edge there, and maybe also in here. Okay, so now we've perfected that mask, I'm free to now go in, and I'll just zoom out so you can see the entire effect here. So we'll go to fit, and then we'll just lower the background tone nicely there. Okay, so again, if you didn't want that, if you wanted a bit more of a gradual transition, we could come in and subtract and go for linear gradient and just drag that up from the top there, just giving a little bit more of a natural edge again on that horizon line here. Okay, so now we can click off that mask. Now one of the things that I'd like to demonstrate here as well is these AI tools, the artificial intelligence tools for selecting sky, selecting subject, have gone through to Photoshop as well. So, and I'll just demonstrate this. We've got an image that I would like to go full screen on a 16:9 aspect ratio monitor. But if I hit that crop tool and choose 16:9, we're going to lose the top edge or ridge of those distant mountains there, which I don't want to do. So I'm going to cancel that out. So let's just hit reset there, and I'll come out of the crop tool. So what I'm going to do, I'll just go rotate that ever so slightly because we've got a slightly crooked image there, and then I'm going to take this image into Photoshop in order to show you some of those AI tools that I mentioned. So we'll go edit in Adobe Photoshop 2022. I just did a right click to access this context menu there. You can go up to the top menus, but right clicking gets you there a little bit faster. Now I'm running a beta version, so we've got a little bit of a warning screen which you can ignore, and this will take this image into Photoshop for editing. And there we have. So we've got the 16:9 aspect ratio there, and you can see the problems with cropping there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate the background layer. I'm going to hit there, go to the select menu and select subject, same AI technologies that we saw in Lightroom Classic there. It's done that. It's a very similar job actually. It's using the same engine, so yes, it's found the emu quite nicely there. We're going to go into the channels, and I'm just going to create a new alpha channel from this selection called Alpha 1. I'm then going to lose the selection, Command D on a Mac, Control D on a PC, and we can now refer to this mask later as we go in and sort of stretch out the background without stretching the emu. This will become a little bit clearer as I demonstrate this. We have this tool called Content Aware Scale. It's some of the older AI technologies which still work quite well. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to protect the Alpha 1, which is my emu, and I'm just going to drag this out, and you'll notice that I'm stretching out the background but not stretching the emu, which is protected from this process. And now if I commit that, now we can't see the additional image that I've stretched out, but it is there just out of view. So if we now go into that crop tool and stretch out, and I'm looking for that 16:9 aspect ratio, you can see that I've stretched even more than I need here, and I'll just create a nice position for that emu before committing that. Okay, so now we have a 16:9 aspect ratio without distorting the shape of that emu, and I can just save, Command S for save, Control S on a PC, and this will because I open this from Lightroom and I go back to Lightroom, you'll see it's in there. It's basically the edited version, and if I go into grid view, it's grouped it with the original. So now I've got that 16:9 aspect ratio. Okay, let's go in and look at some more of the uses of these new masking tools. So I can go in and come back into the masking tool here. So this is an unedited image shot at 10,000 ISO. So rather than adding graduated filters now, I'm going to use this to basically suppress the noise in the background. So I'm just going to 100% so you can see the noise here. And you can see at 10,000 ISO, it's not bad at all. It's protected quite a lot of fine detail in this young kangaroo, but it is becoming noticeable in the background. And because we have the ability to select subject and then invert and then basically raise the noise reduction, and we don't need to be shy here, I can just raise that to plus 100. We've still got a little bit of texture to that bokeh, a little bit of blotchiness, and we can smooth that out even further by grabbing that texture slider and doing a negative texture to get a really smooth bokeh. We're losing a little bit of detail around the whiskers, but you know, if you're basically wanting to suppress noise and you're going to sacrifice a little bit of the edge detail that extends into that bokeh, that might be something that you're willing to sacrifice. So we'll just go in and fit in view, and now I could continue to edit this image. So we could go in and just add a little bit of vibrance, a little bit of contrast, and maybe even a bit of a vignette to finish that image off. Let's move forward, however. Let's take a look at another subject. Okay, so if you've got a little bit of figure ground separation going on anyway, you'll find that this new select subject becomes really quite useful because it can sort of see the sharper edge of your subject, so we'll usually do it really quite well. It might make a few errors in when you've got fine edge details such as fur or feathers sticking out from that edge, but you'll see with a nice clear cut edge it's made a really spectacularly quick job. And then I could go in and trying to get a little bit more foreground separation, I could drag the whites down and the highlights down just to get a little bit more of a pop of this foreground subject here. Let's take a look at, I'll just do one more here, just showing, this is going to be a little bit more of a challenge for the AI technologies. We've obviously clearly defined frog here, but what will Lightroom make of this branch that the frog is sitting on? Is that going to be detected as subject or not? So one way to find out is just hit select subject and see what the masking appears. Now we'll see that it's done quite a good job of selecting the frog, but you can see that there's some areas of the frog that are missed out. So what I will, because I'm going to be working on the background, it's important to invert it at this stage rather than later. And then I can add and subtract. So for instance, I want to be doing noise reduction here, but we can quite clearly see that some aspects of the out of focus frog is also going to be subjected to that noise reduction. That might be a good idea, or you might want to remove that from the mask now. So rather than just looking at the show overlay, we do have a number of options. So color overlay on black and white. You can see that might help you see more clearly where that mask is, especially if your subject was red, and we can change the color of that masking to any other color that we want if we do have a problem there. Or we can go in and choose image on black or image on white, and this might help us quite clearly see. We've just got patchy areas of that. So if I want to subtract, for instance, I could use the brush and then basically brush that in, and what we're doing now is we're protecting this from the noise reduction I'm going to be doing later. I can clean up that edge here, and we can go in and just raise the density to 100 and go in and work on that leg here, because I want to protect that from the eventual noise reduction I'm about to apply, and also the body here. I'm going to protect that as well, and maybe I'll allow the noise reduction to flow through to this, or I could choose to take that out as well. So let's just go back to the color overlay, and then I'll apply my noise reduction, and again negative texture just to smooth out the bokeh there, and we could drop the brightness of that background a touch as well. And you'll see that because I've only half protected this branch, as I darken that down, the branch will darken as well. Okay, so probably the top tip here is just always decide where you're going to be working. If you've selected that subject, if it's the background you're going to be working on, just invert that before continuing to work with the add and subtract tools in order to fine-tune this. Okay, so we'll proceed with the seminar now. I am using the older tools in some of these projects, editing projects, but you'll probably get the idea that these are basically the same tools with just a little bit more of a change to the interface, and of course the addition to the basically the ability to add and subtract, select subject or select sky. These are the new AI technologies, and it's definitely worth having these. And the new workflows about when to use a luminance range and select sky, select subject will become clearer as you work with them. Okay, so let's proceed with the seminar. I captured this image in Japan a few years back. I was using two camera bodies at the time. I think I was using an Alpha 9 with a 70-200 f4 and also an Alpha 6400 with an 85mm prime. I can check which of these two cameras it was by just pressing the I key on the keyboard, and you can see here I'm using the FE 85mm f1.8, so that means it's probably on the Alpha 6400 camera. I could double check that by going to the library module, looking in the metadata, and here we can see it's using the Alpha 6400. Go back to the develop module. Okay, so there was a couple of issues that I was facing when capturing this particular image. One of them, of course, is it was exceptionally low ambient light conditions. Another, we had a mixture of different light sources, both daylight and fluorescent tubes. Never a pretty sight when we were trying to work in color. And that is one of the main reasons I've decided to convert this to black and white. The second reason, of course, is most of the lighting is coming from windows behind these sumo wrestlers, and this creates this nice sort of rim lighting here, and this really comes to play when we look at just the luminance values rather than the color values. It's almost as if the color values get in the way of looking at these tonal values, which sort of highlight the shape and the glistening sweat on the body of these sumo wrestlers. So if I press the I key again, we can cycle through different information. You can see a lot of the time these sumo wrestlers weren't static. I could have perhaps lowered the shutter speed for this one, because this guy is just admiring his reflection in the mirror at this particular stage. But most of the time the sumo wrestlers were active, so I was using a 1/500th of a second. You'll see I'm using maximum aperture, and the ISO is at an incredible high ISO 2500. Not considered quite so high for maybe full frame cameras, but this is sort of pushing the comfort zone, if you like, of say an APS-C sensor. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to hit the reset button so we can go back and we can edit this from scratch. Once you see this, you can see what I'm working with here is we've got a mixture of unpleasant colors coming from the blue daylight coming in through the window and the sort of green fluorescent light that is shining on these sumo wrestlers. So we could try and correct the color values, but as I said, it's easier just to drop to black and white and just look at the luminance values. Slightly crooked, so I'm also going to be looking at cropping this a little bit tighter and cropping out the daylight at the top of the image. So we could do that first. There's no particular order, of course, when working in Lightroom, so I'll just hit the crop overlay here, and then I'll just come to the right side of the image and drag that straighter. I can look at the verticals off the paneling and the mirrors to let me know when I've got a vertical image here. And we've got this toe of this other sumo wrestler just creeping into the corner, and I don't like visual distractions right on the edge. They can draw the viewer's eye to that, and so I'm just going to crop a little bit tighter on that side. Now if the aspect ratio is important to you, we could choose that from this drop down menu here. For instance, I often choose the 16:9 aspect ratio when doing landscapes. That's obviously too long and narrow for this particular scene, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to just do the Command Z or Command Z in order to go back. So I'm basically working with a freeform crop here. If you notice this little padlock is locked, it will lock you into a particular aspect ratio, and then you won't be able to crop into any other shape. So sometimes you might need to unlock that little padlock so you can do a free-form crop where shape is not really that important. Shape might be important if you're going to print and you're trying to match the aspect ratio of the print. And of course I often do use 16:9 because it matches the aspect ratio of most monitors. So I'll just commit that crop, and then we'll go in and just click at the top of the basic panel to black and white. Now that is just a basic adjustment, and it will just default to Adobe Monochrome. But if I click on that, I've got some other options here. These are favorites that I've already favorited by going into the profile browser. We can go into the profile browser just by clicking on those four little oblong shapes here, and then come down to profiles, and you can see we've got a choice of 17 black and white profiles here that we can choose from. and you can see that I've put a little asterisk or star on the top right hand corner because I've already marked that as a favorite, which I can access without coming into this profile browser. You'll see I've also accessed number 4 as well. So what I might do is I might choose 3 as my profile here. Now at any time you can switch that out, but of course this does sometimes offer a better starting point for black and white. What is happening here is some colors are rendered darker or lighter depending on the profile, and so that might be important where we've got these warm skin tones coming in here. So I'll just close that profile browser. You've also got this slider amount which can increase or decrease the effect of that profile. So that is a little bit too high contrast for me, and already the scene is high contrast, so I might just lower that a little bit. Okay, so once we've done that, the next thing to do is just to go in and sort of look at what we're editing. I'm going to zoom in and show you, because I did say that is captured at high ISO, so I'm just going to zoom in. Now in color, sometimes this noise that from the high ISO might become obtrusive. You know, we might find that people are staring at the grain rather than looking at the subject matter. But actually I don't mind this much noise in a black and white conversion, because it does hark back to the days of analog film, where we would expect to have this grain structure inside of the image. If we go into the effects panel, you can also see that if we didn't have this, if this was captured at ISO 100, we could wind in some simulated film grain if we wanted this to hark back to the analog era of using black and white film. I don't need to add that in this instance because I've got some natural structure from that high elevated ISO. There is always the opportunity, of course, and I have been wanting Sony to start putting in backlit illuminated sensors into the APS-C cameras for better high ISO noise performance. But obviously we're still waiting on to see whether Sony will make that move. Okay, so without much further ado, I can start doing some editing. It's not too far off, I have to say. A lot of the areas that I'm looking at are already quite happy with. What I might do is just lower the exposure a little bit. I want to make more of the highlights which won't come down when I'm moving the exposure slider, because as we move the exposure slider, it's predominantly working on the mid-tones, not the highlights. If we are looking at perhaps losing a little bit of detail in those highlights, we could pull the highlights down even further. As you're noticing, my sliders didn't zero out when I hit reset, and that's because I have overridden the default for this specific camera. I did this in a previous seminar, and I'll put a link in the info section below so you can go back and look at how you can create a new developed default, so you don't have to start with all of the sliders set to 0. I prefer to start with the highlights at -60 and the shadows at +60. If we just quickly, just as a reminder, I could go up to the Lightroom preferences and just show you that here we're working with a default that I've created for this particular camera, and that is obviously every time Lightroom detects that we've got an image coming from this camera, it overrides the standard Adobe defaults with the defaults I prefer to start with. And you need one of those for each camera that you're working with. Okay, so I'm going to come over to the graduated filters now and just dial in a negative exposure value. Doesn't really matter exactly how we start here, but probably going down to -2/3 of a stop or so, and bring that down over the top of the image. I'm just trying to get rid of some of those bright tones sitting on this edge. Because we're also coming down over this dark hair of this sumo wrestler, I can protect that. There's two ways of protecting it. I can come into the little brush, the word brush, not the brush icon, and then remove that graduated filter from that area, or I can use a range mask set to luminance, and then just make sure we don't make any of those really dark tones even darker. And so just raising that to 15 on the range mask there means that these tones that are already very dark won't get darker still. Okay, so let's put on a new graduated filter. We'll start with that same. There's a little bit of, this is the edge of the arena we're seeing on this lower edge, and it's just a little bit bright. So again, I'm just bringing that down just by 1 EV or so, and then I'll click off that. I'm thinking that we've got a dark edge here, and it sort of leans towards a lighter paneling. I might choose just to darken that off. It's sort of adding like another bookend to this image, so it channels the viewer's attention towards the center of the image rather than having the eye sort of wander out the right. So what I might do is click on new and then come in with this same amount here. It's just a little bit dark, so I'm going to back that off maybe just to half a stop or so, and select that off. Now we've got good rich detail in the shadows, so I don't need to open those up anymore. When I'm signing off on a project, I often just like to double check I've got a white point and black point. Most images do need the dynamic range often stretching out, so I'll just hold down the Option key on the Mac, Alt key on a PC, just check that I've got some dark tones there. You'll see where the clipping comes in. I don't want to lose those tones, so I'm just going to wind that back until we've got no clipping. So it's only a very small negative value, but it just helps to stretch out, so we're using the full dynamic range. I'll do the same thing with the whites now, holding down the Option key and then dragging that to the right, and you can see we're just losing some highlights there, so working back and just signing off there. This would be a good opportunity maybe to talk about having the Zebras 109 lower limit set. This would give you an early warning to let you know if we're losing any of those really bright highlights coming from the illumination from the windows just behind these sumo wrestlers. So that's always a way of optimizing the exposure, basically using the brightest exposure that doesn't clip the brightest highlights in the image. Okay, so I'm more than happy with that image. If you look at the detail tab, it's already been sharpened by default. This is also part of my custom default for the starting of this camera, where I have sharpening set at 70 and masking set at 70. We could fine tune that at any time. Sometimes, for instance, if your ISO is really becoming obtrusive, you may want to lower that to the default, Adobe's default setting, which would be 40. You might also choose to raise the masking slider so we hide some more of those flat continuous tones. Basically what's happening is here is if you allow sharpening to take place over the entire image surface, you'll also sharpen the noise, and so raising that masking slider is an important part of that. Another aspect of this is clarity. Clarity can also enhance the presence of noise, and of course if that's something that you're not wanting to do, then don't raise the clarity slider in this instance. Much better that if you're wanting more impact, raise the contrast rather than the clarity slider. I'm more than happy with this. It didn't really need a huge amount of work doing, so I'm just going to sign off on that image now. This is an image I captured at a demonstration at Parliament House, and I've captured it with the Alpha 7C with the 35mm f1.4 G Master. As I work in amongst the crowd, I'm often working with a wide angle prime, and obviously that 1.4 maximum aperture does allow me to get figure ground separation, so even people standing directly behind the guy I'm photographing are going to be out of focus. And this is sort of what I like when I'm shooting these portraits at these events. Now the other camera that I was using was a full frame camera as well, and I was using a 135 prime. So the 135 prime would be used if I was working outside of the crowd, at the edge of the crowd, and the 35mm 1.4 when I'm working in amongst the crowd. So that gives you an idea of working with two bodies, two cameras. Now if you look at the info in the top left hand corner there, you can see obviously the maximum resolution of this camera is 6,000 4000 by 4000 pixels. So you can see the crop dimensions there. So you can see that I've cropped just a very small amount here. It's also listing the lens. If I want to cycle through the information, just press the I key. You can see working at that maximum 1.4 aperture, even though it's a rainy day, I'm still getting quite a fast shutter speed here, and at the base level ISO 100. So without much further ado, I'm going to hit the reset button to start from scratch. Very different image. You notice what has happened here is the area around the guy's face is much brighter than the face itself, and that can be a distraction. We ideally want people to navigate towards the hero portrait shot and not have those distracting bright highlights surrounding that. So this is obviously the main part of the edit for this particular image. If you cast your eye over to that basic panel again, you'll see that the sliders aren't zeroed out because I have a camera default for the Alpha 7C. Again, you can see I'm using -60 on the highlights and +60 on the shadows with a little bit of added contrast. See, I've got a little bit of clarity, some vibrance, and a tiny little bit of saturation. The theory behind using vibrance and saturation is if I'm wanting warmer tones to increase in their richness as well as the rest of the color tones, you do sometimes have to do a little bit of a kick with that saturation slider. Generally, most of the heavy lifting for how vibrant you want your colors should be done with the vibrant sliders. It does protect colors from going what's called out of gamut. It makes sure that you can increase the richness of colors and also protect the texture within those colors by keeping the colors within gamut. I've got obviously that PDF and video tutorial on color management if you want to research that subject in greater depth. So you can see why the image was a little bit smaller than the full resolution. I've done most of the zooming with my feet, but it has a little bit crooked, and so I'm going just to do a small rotation clockwise using the verticals in the background to guide me as to when this image is actually straight. Now if I wanted to use the overlay, remember you can cycle through the overlays just by pressing the O key, and this is the rule of thirds, but you might choose to use the rule of thirds, or you might choose one that is called the golden ratio. So I might use the golden ratio in this instance, and I'll just put maybe the eye of my hero subject just on the intersection point. Of course, you can not have to use these overlay guides if you want to. You don't have to use this as a straitjacket, and even as I'm explaining aligning using these overlays, I'm sort of changing my mind and thinking I will probably go to the rule of thirds in this instance because I want to lose more of the top of the image. Okay, so once we've got that framing, I will just commit that crop. What I'm going to do now is to get rid of some of these brighter tones. I might choose to drag the highlight slider down even further, which is improving this, but not improving it enough. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do some graduated and radial filters. So it's a fast way of what's called dodging and burning, redistributing tonal values. So I want to get rid of some of the bright tones surrounding the hero portrait here. So we'll just go into the graduated filter, double click the word effect to zero everything, and then just dial down -1 stop, and then bring that down over the top of the image. Now I can just bring that a little bit lower if needs be. I'm just watching the forehead to make sure that that doesn't go too dark as I darken the hoodie that the guy is wearing, but that's okay. We've got the top that is also wearing quite bright down at the bottom edge, so I might use the same value to do one from the bottom of the image coming up to the top. That sort of handles what the guy is wearing, except his shoulder is a little bit hot, and also the police officer wearing the face mask is quite hot on this side. So I might come in with a radial filter -1 still, same setting, and just come in and drag that down so over the shoulder as well. It's a little bit dark, so I'll just back up maybe to half a stop or so. Same thing with this woman standing to his right. Is she's also got some very bright tones there, predominantly around the face mask and the top of her t-shirt. So again, I'll just drag that, and again it's a little bit too much, so just back that off to half a stop. Sometimes if you're just working with the midtones and you just want to prioritize the highlights instead, we could move that highlights down instead of the midtones. Sometimes you might need a little bit of both, to be honest. What I'm going to do now is click on the new. This time I'm coming in with a positive value, maybe a third of a stop or so, and drag that in over this guy's face. Now I'm sort of like shining a little bit of extra light, but what I don't want is to shine that light on the bridge of his nose as well, which is already getting a little bit hot. So I could click on the brush there, and holding down the Alt key on a PC, Option key on a Mac, and making sure you've got your flow set to 100, then just come in and wipe that third of a stop increment off the nose. So now we're getting a third of a stop brighter all over the face, except I've removed it from the nose. If you want an overlay to see where you're applying that adjustment, you can go into the toolbar. If you don't see the toolbar, press the T on the keyboard to show toolbar. And you can see where the red overlay is where I'm applying that plus exposure, except you can see there's a hole in that mask overlay where that is not being applied, where I removed that with the brush. Just a word about that brush that I was just been using there. It's the word brush, not the adjustment brush that I've been using in this instance. Okay, the brush is a separate feature all by itself, and you can just brush in adjustments here. If you say wanting to just brush this area along this guy's area here, just make sure you've got auto mask switched off. If you don't have any definitive edges, which is nearly always the case if you're working with a very shallow depth of field, you can get some unnatural artifacts if you have the auto mask switched on and you're brushing exposure up against that. It's a great feature if you've got a very sharp edge. You know, you're in that zone of sharpness and you want to stay behind, but in this case I just want to use a freeform brush without the auto mask on. I'm just going to increase the size of that brush. I'm going to tap the close square bracket key a number of times in order to increase that and just come in there. That's a positive exposure adjustment, and I wanted a negative exposure adjustment in this instance. It's not really targeting that very bright highlight, so I might come down to the white slider and just bring that in instead of the exposure. Double clicking the slider will zero that slider, and what I'm doing now is I'm just bringing in the brightness using the whites instead of exposure or highlights. The whites controls the extreme right of that histogram there. I think I'm nearly done here, except the eyes are just a little bit darker. Case of the hoodie is just putting a little bit of shadow in those, so I might come over to that adjustment brush and add plus half a stop, again without that auto mask on. Decrease the size of the brush using the open square bracket, and then just brush a little bit of extra light into those eyes, so those really become the focal point of this image. And we're pretty much done now. If you want to sort of draw the viewer's eye more rapidly in towards the image, I have my starting point for post-crop vignetting set to -10, but you can always go a little bit higher than that. Be careful not to overcook these vignettes. They can become very noticeable, especially if images are presented quite small. Here I've come down to -20. I always prefer the color priority to the highlight priority. I find the color priority doesn't clip any shadow tones that might be resting in the corners, such as this bottom right corner here. And if you want to finish this image off, we can just optimize whites and blacks. I'll hold down the Alt key PC, Option key Mac, and then find a white point for this image. Now there are some instances where having a white point isn't always desirable, and this is one of those instances. So I'm going to wind back and just choose a white point by feel rather than choosing where the actual clipping point occurs. And then the same thing with the blacks. We can't really raise the blacks before clipping occurs, just there in that behind the hoodie there. So that is pretty much done. As you're probably aware that I've overridden the defaults. Here I've got sharpening set to 75, masking set to 75. That completes this edit of this portrait captured at a demonstration in Melbourne. Let's take a look at this portrait I captured at a parade in Melbourne. Now obviously I've got this young woman's attention, and one of the things that I really loved about this particular image is the very wide-eyed expression that she's giving me here. She's obviously at complete comfort with the camera. As I'm walking around these type of events, you know, I can get a sense, I can get an inkling of whether somebody's receptive to having their portrait taken. Is if I look at somebody and I'm obviously holding the camera you know, quite high, if somebody frowns at me, I'm just going to move on to the next person. But if I smile at them and they smile back, then obviously there's already a rapport starting, and I know they're going to be reasonably receptive to having the portrait. And I might say a few words, and because sometimes you get people doing these very cheesy grins or posing unnaturally, and I'll just take one picture like that, and then I'll just say, now relax, just relax. You know, you don't have to grin, or you don't have to pose for this one. And that might be the second and the best image. And I'll often move a little bit closer as they're comfortable being photographed with more than one shot. And I rarely take one shot in these type of situations. I'll take 2 or 3, and I'll edge closer. Now in this instance, you'll see from the info panel in the top left, I'm working with the 135 G Master, and I'm working with maximum aperture. If this young woman had her head turned at a slight angle, I'd only get one of the eyes sharp. So if both eyes being sharp was important, I would stop down maybe as far as f4 or 5, 6, depending on how close I am to the subject. Now I'm not that close, and often when I'm working with the 135 lens, it's because I'm at the edge of the crowd and I can't get in amongst the crowd, which is the case in this particular photograph. I do have a second body. I'm also carrying the Alpha 7C with the 35mm f1.4 G Master when I'm working up very close and I'm in amongst the crowd. Okay, so let's hit the reset, and we'll start editing this image. We'll go into the develop module, and I'll hit reset. As you can see, the image is quite different. You can see how different basically redistributing tone can be. We've looked at this in the other portrait that I edited, that demonstration, where having surrounding tone is much brighter, sort of it removes the impact of the portrait. And again, we're going to be doing something similar. And we've got some foreground. I don't actually mind this foreground out of focus banner or street poster. Sometimes I'll actually purposely stand in front of something that is going to be in the foreground and out of focus. I like out of focus backgrounds and out of focus foregrounds as well. I think it builds a little bit of depth into these images, so I'll actively try and introduce that in some of the work that I do. Again, the image is a little bit crooked, and I want to go in a little bit tighter. This woman standing on the left side, even though she's well out of focus, is a little bit distracting. I just want to focus on the profile of this young woman in the foreground and the woman looking directly at the camera. So the first thing I'll do is I'll come into the crop tool. I'll press the R on the keyboard, and then I'll just rotate that image. I'm looking for quite a straight image in this instance. Okay, so it's a freeform crop at the moment, but I might actually lock that into maybe a 3:2 aspect ratio, which is the aspect ratio of the camera. So that 3:2 is or 2:3 as it's described here, is the same shape as the sensor that we're working with. And of course that might guide you to how you use the rule of thirds, or as I said, that there is the other one, which is the golden ratio, if we wanted that just to be a little bit higher in the frame. In this instance I'm going to go with that golden ratio and click off that crop tool. So that's going to be my framing for this image. Again, I'm going to come in with some graduated filters, so I'll drop down to maybe 2/3 of a stop and coming in from below. That pushes a lot more tone into that foreground, and also up there in the top. I might actually come in with a third one coming in from that left hand side. I want some tone and texture or information in that sky in the background, and I think it could be bluer than it actually is, so I'm just going to wind the temperature down on that left side so we get some cooler tones coming in to that sky. As I look at the crop now, I'll also notice we've just got that strap coming in on the extreme right hand corner, so I'm just going to crop a little bit tighter there so we don't have anything distracting right on the edge of the frame. Okay, so I'm going to actually come in with a little bit more of a graduated filter than the default I have for this camera, which is -10, coming down. Maybe that's probably a little bit severe, so I'll just back off, maybe down to -25. Okay, and then coming back to the basic panel. To complete this edit, I'm just going to zoom in on this young woman's face here. Now, if we're going to do any retouching, what I'd like to do in this context is just remove stuff that would probably not be there maybe a few days later. So we've got some marks on her face that are really just temporary, and I'm more than comfortable to remove those, but I'm not going to start removing moles and things. I'm just going to start removing some of these red marks. Some of this redness in the skin could actually be targeted by coming down to the HSL panel, that's hue, saturation and luminance. We'll come over to hue, and if we target the reds and then move those towards more orange skin tones, you can see how the red or ruddy tones in her complexion are rendered warmer by doing that. Now it does sort of hit or target the lips as well, and we don't have any masking opportunities in Lightroom currently there where we can remove that. So if I do choose to remove some of the reds to more towards the oranges, then I'm going to have to paint over the lips with a sort of a red hue. So I'm going to do that just to show how if somebody does have very red tones, maybe they've got a red nose or whatever, you can target that by using that hue slider here for the reds and moving them towards the orange. So what I'll do is I'll just come in with the brush, and what I'll do now is I'll just come and pick up, I'll just double click the word effect to begin with, then I'm going to click up the color, and I'll just select reds over there for the brush color, and I'll target that now and paint that over the lips. Now we can increase the saturation as well, slider, when we're doing this, so that there we go. So there we got the reds coming back into those lips, and if that's a little bit too much, just wind those back a little bit so not quite so red in the lips. The little marks on the face, the little pimples and things that are just temporary, part of the skin complexion, I'm going to remove with this spot removal tool, and I've got the size set to 25, and I'm just going to target one of those underneath the nose there. Now whenever you're working with this tool, especially in these skin tones, you will have to drag that source point quite often. It might select something wholly inappropriate, so let's just do one on the cheek there, and there's a couple of spots as well, must be glitter or something on this young woman's face, just decreasing the size of that, and there's one also in the hairline as well, I can see. and I'll just move that. It's targeted a strand of hair rather than skin. And I think there's a little bit of a few gremlins, and I don't know how many people would see this, what I'm editing now. It's one of the things that if you are editing at 100%, you can't guarantee anybody's going to see what we're actually doing here, because the image presented on social media will be a lot smaller. So what I'm doing there's probably just a few fragments of food in the corners of the mouth there, and I see there's a little bit of white in the corner of the eye. And let's just drag that down. It's hardly ever picking an appropriate point. Because the skin texture changes as it moves across the face, I'm always looking for a more appropriate point to reference that. Okay, so now that I'm happy with those adjustments, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come to the adjustment brush. Now I could just dial in the settings I'm looking to use here, but there is a preset that Lightroom ships with, and that is Iris Enhance. And what I'm going to do is just enhance this young woman's irises. They're already pretty good, I have to say, but they are going to look even stronger by the time I've finished here, and maybe just a little bit brighter than the default has set. Okay, so let's just click off the adjustment brush, and I'll just zoom back out to look at that work. And I think this is I'm really quite happy with that edit. I don't think I need to go any further than that in this instance, so I'll sign off on this edit as well. Let's take a look at this portrait edit of this young man. Now I've captured this in front of an open doorway. Now we're getting a lot of the natural daylight, not sunlight, but just the daylight striking his face. Now you'll notice that there's no dark shadows in his eyes, and this is because he's standing in front of a covering in front of the doorway, and this means that the skylight isn't coming directly down from above, it's coming in at a much lower angle, and this is very flattering light for capturing portraits. Now I've used my favorite portrait lens, the FE85mm 1.8 wide open. Now again, if you are capturing somebody with their head turned at an angle and you want both eyes sharp, you would need to stop that down. Now if you're standing very close, you might find that the eyebrows become a little bit soft, so you might want to just stop down, maybe even to f2.8 if you want the eyebrows pin sharp as well as the retinas of the eyes. You see that I don't really mind the shallow depth of field. The ears are already well out of focus, but I actually like this. You can also see the tip of the nose is out of focus as well. This I really don't mind. I also like this tight crop. Obviously, as the closer you go to the portrait, the shallower the depth of field. So as an alternative to stopping down is you could just step 1 or 2 steps backwards, and this would also increase the depth of field. And that would be important if you're working in low ambient light and you don't want to stop the aperture down. Okay, so let's hit the reset button. So we'll go into the develop module, and I'll hit reset, so we look at the original colors of this image. Now you can see the edit is working with a much narrower color palette. You can see the colors in the face now. We've got some quite red eyes and red lips, and this is just the default settings of the as shot white balance. And so these are a couple of things that I'm going to be tackling, is just to even out the colors spread across that face, get rid of some of those reddy tones. Now if you look at the basic sliders here, of course they're not zeroed out because again I've overridden the defaults. So you're probably getting used to the fact that I start with minus highlights, plus shadows, a little bit of contrast, a little bit of vibrance. In this instance I'm going to zero the vibrance. I think the colors are just getting a little bit too lively there. In fact, I might even come down to a negative minus 25 just to handle the colors. This is already looking a lot better. The other thing I can do to handle those colors is coming into the HSL panel, and this is the red slider. We can see, I'll just click saturation, and you can see the reds here. Those are the ones that I'm trying to get rid of here. So if we go into and just lower the saturation of those reds, We can also go into the hue slider and push those reds towards a warmer orange tone there, and this is already starting to limit the color palette. So that has done quite well. If you notice the lips become a little bit too desaturated, you could come in and with just an adjustment brush, double click the word effect, coming in with saturation and restoring some of the saturation to those lips there. I'll just return to the basic panel by clicking on that adjustment brush icon one more time. I think what I might do now is come in and do a small rotation. Don't mind the slight tilt of the head, but I think I'm going to go for a more straight on look there. I also noticed that there's some sunglasses tucked into his t-shirt there, so I might just bring in that crop icon maybe on the left side, just so I remove that distraction on that lower level there. Now I'll just center the eyes in that frame, and I think that is the sort of crop I'm looking for here. Now, yep, I think I'll go with that. Maybe just a slight adjustment back. Okay, so once we've got that crop, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come into the basic panel. Now you can see the starting point is opening up the shadows. I might go the opposite way for this instance. I don't like to see just my defaults becoming a straitjacket. I will override these occasionally, and in this instance, rather than having open shadows, I'm going to come in and close those shadows down. I'm looking for that much darker background that I want here. And the highlights I'm actually going to restore and make a little bit lighter. I really like the pale skin against these much darker shadow tones, and I might take that vibrance down a little bit more. Now, one of the ways that you could create more of an even tone is perhaps raise the temperature slider and then wind the vibrance down just a little bit more. This is evening out the tones. Compare that to the original where we had some very red tones in amongst the warmer skin tones. Now this is becoming much more monochromatic, which I like. So once we've done that, I'm going to increase the contrast a little bit as well. Now I've got a little bit of a lighter patch behind here, so I might just come in with an adjustment brush, dial in a negative value there. Going to use a much larger brush here, so just increasing the brush size. Just check you've got your density and flow set to 100. They can tip lower, and of course they're what's called sticky settings, so if you are using a lower density or flow earlier, that will be the settings that you're coming into now. So I'm just winding that down. You can see that I'm getting rid of that hot spot or slightly lighter background tone there, and I might just come down a little bit more. I think the headphones are perhaps just a little bit bright, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to grab that adjustment brush with a new brush. So just check that that pin is not got the little dot in, because otherwise I'll be modifying that. So we're going to go to new. See, the pin is now empty. Just using a much smaller brush. I'm using the open square bracket to change the brush size there, and I'm just going to double click the exposure or double click effect to zero all sliders. I'm going to come down with the whites. Obviously this the headphones are going to be right over here on the right side, so I'm just going to bring the headphones just down a touch, like so. So they're not quite so bright. Now the iris of the eyes are already looking pretty good, but I think I might go in and just create that new brush again. We'll zoom in, so let's just remove that, and we'll zoom in. Command plus on a Mac or Control plus on a PC to zoom in. I'll just zoom in one more, and we'll come down to that Lightroom preset, the iris enhance here, and I'll just raise that exposure to half a stop. And now I'll just decrease that size of the brush even more, just to push around those irises there. And this should be really make the eyes pop in this instance. There's no other adjustments that I want to really make to the face, other than that I just noticed there's a very small speck on his lip there, which I'll just remove. And in this instance it's picked an appropriate source point for that. and I'll now zoom back out. And I think this is pretty much the way I want to finish up this image. A really much more powerful portrait. Compare that to the starting point for this image. See how significant difference that editing has made just by limiting the color palette, brightening the skin tones, darkening the background. And I think this is now really quite a strong portrait. And if you haven't used this lighting technique before, certainly try it out. I call it the open door technique, where you've just got to stand somebody in front of an open doorway. Obviously the door is open, so you got the light from the skylight doesn't tend to extend back into the interior. The fall off is quite rapid, so you can get that studio dark background effect without actually taking your the subject into the studio, and very even flattering light for the portraits. Okay, so I'll move on to the next image now. Let's take a look at one more portrait edit here. Now this was captured with the 135mm G Master, and again, as you might expect, I'm working at maximum aperture. Now I could have got clear line of sight for this guy, but I've purposely positioned myself so I've got a couple of other band members that I'm shooting between. This builds up that foreground blur that I am looking for in this instance. Now of course, as things unfold and people are moving quite quickly, you do find yourself doing a little bit of dance to thread your angle of view through the gap. Now I actually like this. I think it does create a sort of a defocus frame for viewing this guy with this really nice smile. Now I'm going to hit the reset button. Now I've described how I actually captured the image, and we'll see what the camera made of this scene. The auto white balance, of course, has got very warm shot here, 6200. Now it's very unlikely that it needs that much correction. So what the auto white balance has done is it's been overly influenced by the amount of cool tones over those white fabrics. So the first thing I'm going to do with this image is try and correct that white balance. Now there's a couple of ways of doing this. We can go from the as shot, which is the auto white balance of the camera. We could try Lightroom's auto response, but I suspect it's going to make a very similar sort of mess of that job. So again, we could go down to daylight. Now this will be cooler. There you go, 5500 degrees, and that is getting down to the coolness that I like. You can try working with this tool, but it can be very unpredictable. You might think that whites, clicking on the whites would simply do the white balance, but it very rarely does do that, especially when targeting whites. It's gone back for a warm approach. So you'll often find that if you are going to click on a tone and you don't actually have a white balance reference in the scene, it's much better to go for one of the things that you know to be neutral, such as black hair is neutral, and it's less likely to pick up an influence of neighboring tones. So I could try clicking there, or I could try clicking on his hair here, and that's obviously too cool. So what I might do is I might just go and click on that daylight, and I might skew it a little bit cooler. So I'll just highlight that field, and holding down the shift key I'll click on the down arrow just to drop it down a few 100 degrees. I actually do like the slightly cooler blue tones of these uniforms now. Now again, we've seen in previous portrait edits where the face is struggling to still be the hero because some of the surrounding tones are quite bright. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over to the radial filter tool here, double click the word effect, then I'm going to raise that maybe almost as much as a stop. I'm just sort of guessing that starting amount here, and just wind that out over that face. Again, I quite like that. Probably the nose is a little bit too bright, so what I'm going to do is click on that brush tool. So in order to remove some of that adjustment, I can either modify the original adjustment by holding down the Alt Option key, and that allows me to remove that adjustment. I would need to lower the flow if that was the case, because I don't want to remove all of the adjustment, just some of it. You might actually find it easier just to create a new radial filter, and then come in and just lower that maybe by 1/3 of a stop or so, like so, just keeping it very narrow there because I only just want to affect the tip of the nose there. Okay, so I'm also going to click on the new and come in with a positive adjustment just for underneath the brim of the hat. The tones are just going fractionally darker up at the top of the hat there. I'm just going to rotate that into position, so we've got a positive adjustment just going over the eyes there, and half a stop should do the trick nicely. So we got some good adjustments there. I noticed there's a dark mark on the chin, and now if that's not a birthmark or a mole, I might choose to remove that. It's a little bit distracting, so just increasing the size of the spot healing brush, and just make sure that it doesn't use an inappropriate source, which it has. He's got a little bit of stubble on his chin, so just going to push that to replicate that texture or tone, so it's a good repair job there. And as I'm zoomed in, I also noticed that there's something else by the corner of the eye I want to adjust. By holding down the space bar, I can drag the face into the center here. You can see how beautifully sharp this 135 lens is as I do this, by the way. So what I'm going to do is just click on just reducing the size of that, and I'm just going to draw a little line coming down there, and again just move that into the corner of the eye, and that removes that little blemish there. So that's all I really need to do with this face here. So I'll just click off that tool and zoom back out. We've distributed the tones quite nicely. I might just raise the exposure value a little bit. I might also raise the white. So I'm just going to hold down the Alt Option key to access threshold view to make sure I don't clip any tones. And just a small amount of adjustment. These tones that are clipping off the brushes, they're called specular highlights. And that is okay. It's okay to clip these small areas because those are the reflection of the light source off this polished metal. So it's okay to have that as bright as we like. And I'm also going to hold down the Alt Option key and find a black point right up in there in the top extreme left hand corner of the image. So we'll just back that off so there's no clipping into that extreme corner. And -10 should do nicely. So one of the things that I could look at with this one, I'm not too sure whether I want to do this or not, but the only way of trying it is just to suck it and seal it, so to speak, is to look at that highlight priority, switch it over to a color priority, and then come in and darken the corners even more. And I'm not too sure how much I want to do that. We can also drag the midpoint in, so that will really sort of tunnel in, as you can see, the midpoint, and increase the feather as well, and back off on the amount there. So what I'm doing is I'm just bringing in the vignette much further from the edges, and also increasing the feather so it's not going to be at all obvious. And if you just wanted to see the original, we can just go hit the reset. And so as you can see, the face is really not performing as well as it should with that yellow white balance that was skewed because of the white uniforms here. And also just brightening up that face and darkening the bright tones makes the world of difference to this portrait image. This image was captured after returning from the UK, and I was in hotel quarantine in Australia, and it coincided with me having to do a review of the Alpha 7C camera. So there was a quarantine or an exercise yard linked to the hotel quarantine, and this was captured during one of those exercise periods, if you like. Now if you look at the settings I'm using the kit lens, surprisingly small yet sharp kit lens, the 28-60mm f4 to 5.6. Now often you probably know that I'm using primes wide open, but in this instance, because I'm not trying to isolate an individual character here, the greater depth of field that I'm capturing at f5.6 on a wide angle focal length 28mm is going to render everything sharp. So let's take a look at the what the camera saw, and then we'll get back to or somewhere close to this point. So I'll just hit the reset. Now it was a grabbed image. I didn't point the camera at these people for very long, and I probably was using the vari-angle screen as well, not wanting to make myself conspicuous by photographing other people in quarantine. I did let the police people who were in charge of the exercise yard know what I was doing, so I had sort of permission from some people to be photographing in this area. So first off, it is slightly skewed, so I'll just hit the R key on the keyboard to come in for that crop marquee, and then rotate that. So I've got that center line just on that figure on the left there, so the center line is lining up with that grid overview there. Now I've got some stuff on the extreme left which I don't want people to look at, so I'm just going to crop in. Now we've got also I've got this V shape on the top there, and I don't really want that, so I'm going to come in and select one of my favorite aspect ratios, which is the 16:9 aspect ratio, and I'm going to come in and just position that probably around about there, and then commit that as my 16:9 crop. Now I don't want the viewer's eye just going out of the top of the frame. Obviously these people are doing a little bit of sunbaking in the only puddle of light in the exercise yard, but I do want to darken this down so the people in the center of the frame become the real heroes of this image. So we're going to come to a graduated filter, and I probably want this quite dark, so I'm going to come in probably just under 2 stops there, and then darken this down, and it may even go darker than this. Yep, okay, 2 stops should do the trick nicely. I also think that a vignette probably might enhance, but already these 2 corners are probably dark enough. So what I'm going to do is maybe instead of the vignette, I'm just going to come in with another graduated filter, this time at an angle from the left side here. Maybe not nearly as much as that, maybe only minus half a stop or so, just a little bit darker. Okay, so what I'm also going to thinking about this is we could probably make a little bit more about the patterns of light here. So I'll just come and grab a radial filter, double click the word effect. I'm going to come in with some clarity here, which should enhance some of the textures in this area, and maybe take out a little of the exposure in that area as well, and that's working really nicely in that area now. Okay, we might find that this guy's face is just a little bit dark in that shadow, so I'm just going to zoom in and put in a little bit of a radial filter, and up with a positive value, maybe 2/3 of a stop or so, and put that in over his face so it's not too dark. Maybe raise that to a whole stop or so, and we're good. Now I don't think those are clipping, but I probably want to just check that we are going to get as much detail as possible in those highlights. You notice the sliders haven't zeroed out, and yet I have a default which is not to have all of these sliders zeroed out on my Alpha 7C, but this was a pre-production camera, so it's flying under the radar of Lightroom, seeing it is actually an A7C file. So I'm just going to have to drag those highlights down. It's giving me a little bit more texture and tone. Some of these shadow tones are a little bit too dark, so again opening up those shadows. You probably see why I often have these as defaults, raised shadows and lower highlights here now. And also it's already got quite a lot of contrast, but I'm just going to give that a little bit of a kick as well. Just a very small graduated filter with minus half a stop on the lower edge there. And knowing that the defaults didn't kick in here, so I'm also going to have to look at the detail panel to make sure that I've got the sharpening in. So let's just bring that in to like 70 or so, and also 70 on the masking. I'll just hold down the Alt Option key. Now I'm obviously not going to mask too much of the continuous tones here because I actually quite like the sharpening happening with all of the texture over the concrete, so this will suffice in this instance. I'm probably just going to check the white points. I'm using the full dynamic range of the image, so let's just wind that back so there's no clipping whatsoever. Same with the blacks. Okay, that's sort of, I don't really mind the clipping in those areas, okay, but I don't want the flat surfaces clipping, just the gaps between those grills are okay to clip. It's basically the absence of a surface, as Ansel Adams would put to zone 0 in order to get a complete absolute black in that image. Okay, so very quick edit, but I think that's got me to where I need to go. Let's edit this image that I captured in the alleyways of Melbourne CBD. Now this was when I was reviewing the 12-24G Master. Now obviously Sony have a 12-24G, the f4 lens. So I made a mission of going out and shooting at the widest aperture. It also gave me a reason to explain how much depth of field you get at the 12mm focal length, even with an aperture as wide as f2.8. Now we don't have pin sharp focus in the lower left hand corner or the absolute right if you're being super critical, but you can see even with this quite deep image we have extraordinary depth of field with that 12mm focal length. There isn't often much need to stop down below f4 in order to get this overall depth of field. So this was really just to highlight two things: how this lens performs wide open, and how much depth of field you can get at f2.8. So let's take a look at the original edit, okay, or the original capture I should say. So we're just going to hit the reset. Now I would have captured this using the monitor rather than putting the camera to my eye. You can see this guy is aware of my presence, but being such a wide focal length, he probably is not too sure whether I'm capturing the street murals or whether he's going to be a hero of the shot as well. So I'll just press the R key on the keyboard to access the crop overlay in order to start straightening the verticals of this image. So I'll just go for that vertical in the middle and ignore the verticals on the edges. Those will be tackled with the transform panel. Now you can sometimes get an auto correction, but I think this probably won't do the job. I'll click on it. You know, sometimes it does get it, but in this case it doesn't, so I'll just do a Command Z to step back, and then we'll use the vertical tool. Now just basically drag that, and by eye, looking at the verticals on the left side, extreme left and extreme right, make sure those are running parallel to the edges of the frame. So just a +9 correction seems to do that job. Now you'll see that there's some white canvas area in the top left and top right hand corners of the image, so we need to get rid of that by hitting the constrain crop checkbox there, and that will just magnify the image just so we get that canvas area removed from view. We can see that we've still got a little bit of a lean out there, so we might have to go one higher on there, maybe even two. You can, if you find that the vertical on the left side is now leaning in, we can also manage this by avoiding the crop overlay, but just by doing this in the rotate field here. I'm coming down to a minus 0.2 there with an 11 crop, and I think this will, yeah, that'll do the trick. Okay, so let's come out from that transform and back into one of the editing tools. I'm going to use graduated filters. I find this roadway here is a little bit bright. Now because this was my defaults rather than Adobe's defaults, I already have two graduated filters in place, and they are applying some darkening to both top and bottom. These are things that I often do with most of my images, so I have them in position as a developed default, if you like. So what I'm going to do with this one, because it's not darkening it enough, minus half a stop isn't enough, I'm also going to swing it into place and drag it closer to the guy, and then decrease that by maybe a stop or more, 1 1/3 stops. And this one in the top, I'm also going to swing in the opposite direction because I don't need to darken that corner there. Just drawing down the tones on that top there, maybe a little bit more. We might come in with more graduated filter for the wall on the extreme edge, half a stop darker on there as well. Okay, so just a redistribution of tones there. Now the white balance is doing a pretty good job. That's the auto white balance, but I'm reasonably happy. If anything, the tint slider is just a little bit high, so I'll just drag that down a little bit. And if we really wanted to get maximum sort of punch from here, we might consider either raising the clarity or texture just to get a little bit more punch in those street murals that we've got going here. And again, just to finish off the image, I'll hold down the Alt Option key, check I've got a white point, which I do, check I've got a black point, which I also have one there as well. So that concludes that very quick edit of this street image.